Number 1. A little over a year ago, I spent the summer backpacking Southeast Asia. For reference, I am a college-aged female, and most of my traveling was done alone. Around 3 weeks into my trip, I was in Chiang Mai, Thailand, where I stayed for a few days before heading further into the mountains. I had joined up an organized group at that point, which had pre-booked the hotel that we were staying at. That afternoon, I went to go drop off my backpack in my room, where I was staying alone, and the minute I walked in, something felt very, very wrong. It's a feeling that I don't even know how to describe. I immediately felt as if I were being watched, and I made a point to put my head down and avoid looking at the mirrors that were in the room, out of fear of something or someone watching me. As time went on, I realized that the more time I spent in the room, the worse it would affect my thoughts and emotions. That night, I kept seeing a vision of a woman dressed in all white with black hair, covering her face, standing in my room. I didn't even close my eyes whilst I was showering out of fear of her standing there when I opened my eyes. I could have sworn I wasn't alone in the room, and that the other presence was malicious. Also, that night, I was walking back out of the bathroom, and I glanced at the glass bottles of water that were set out. In my head, a whole scenario played out of me breaking the glass water bottle on the table and using it to slip both my wrists. I'd never had any thoughts like that, and so I was extremely distressed and scared. Next morning, I got up early and left my hotel room to do some sightseeing. About an hour in, I felt extremely nauseous and lightheaded, afraid I was going to pass out on the street. I went back to my hotel room and lay down to get some rest. As soon as I was back in there, an overwhelming sense of dread hit me. I got the idea in my head that I was going to die that day. Everything in my mind was telling me that once I closed my eyes, I would never wake again. I kept telling myself that I was probably just ill or dehydrated, so I kept drinking water and telling myself I was going to be okay. I was still awake, but I shut my eyes, and immediately I had a vision that demons were grasping onto my ankles and tried to pull me into hell. At that moment I was praying and screaming in my head. In my vision, something grabbed my hand and pulled me up, and then I passed out for several hours. When I awoke, I immediately left my hotel room and felt fine. But that night when I came back, I was having the same vision of the woman and feeling like I wasn't alone. We left the next morning, and nothing remotely similar has happened to me ever since. But I've always been left wondering what that experience could have meant. Also, we stayed in the hotel one more time a week later, and I was in a different room, and everything felt completely normal. One thing's for certain, I'm glad I didn't have to stay again in room 241. Number 2. As long as my friend's little girl could talk, she would always mention her dark friend. They assumed that this was an imaginary friend, or some name that she heard in a story in daycare. It went on for many months. As she began to improve her speaking, she'd talk about her dark friend more and more. Recently, my buddy heard her jabbering over the monitor one night, and he heard her call her dark friend Miranda. Again, thinking this was a friend from daycare, they moved on. But after finding out that daycare didn't have a Miranda, they realized they didn't know anyone called that name. It's not common at the moment, and she really has no reason to know it. They did a bit of research. It didn't take them long to find out that a woman called Miranda had died in the house that they were living in. She wasn't the person who owned the home before them. It had been an owner or two back, but her name was Miranda, and she died inside the house. They pulled up the obituary and called their daughter. Without any prompting, they simply asked her, "Hey Army, do you know who this is?" And she got excited and said, "That's my dark friend." It's a suburban house, less than 10 years old, so not something that you'd figure for a haunting. But this was the most legitimate evidence I've ever heard. They are a super normal family, and I'd never expect them to lie about anything like this. It makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up every time I think about it. Number 3. Around 2010, I was doing Weight Watchers. I got into this groove where I'd go on walks all the time. Nighttime walking was nothing different. I'd lived with my dad in a neighborhood across the street from a Catholic church. I grabbed my iPod and ran out the door. I would take a route that would go along the side of a church, around the back out of my neighborhood, in basically a large circle. So it's around 9 p.m. I was walking back home, and I decided that it would be fine to sit on the swings in the church playground, to cool off and listen to some tunes. I might have been there for about 6 or 7 minutes, and I got off the swings and turned towards the cemetery. I looked up for what was only a moment, and 2 shadowy figures came running towards me. As a tradition with most people who have experienced this kind of thing, you're in shock, not really able to move. The 2 shadows ran past me, and when I turned the other way to get a good look at them, there was nothing there. Just a single parking lot light around 200 yards away. I stuck around for a few more minutes looking at my surroundings. I tried debunking right away, looking at any possible light sources that could have maybe been in motion, causing some kind of shadow scattering effect when cast on an object. After that encounter, I stopped walking at night and haven't seen anything like that since. Number 4. Around 9 p.m. last night here in Florida, I was hanging out with my buddy in my backyard, just sitting on a picnic table adjacent to his house on some woods with his baby monitor. We were in the middle of a conversation. As I was speaking, I began to feel the typical ringing in your ears. The sensation that everybody gets from time to time. I was not shocked, as I truly believed it was normal and probably being produced by my body, not heard as an external stimuli. Then quickly, about 10 seconds later, the sound intensifies as I was still speaking. The ringing became loud, louder than my own voice. I can feel it almost shaking my brain. It's extremely high-pitched, and my ears aren't usually the best at picking up high frequencies. I begin to panic. What the hell? Am I going deaf right now? It was the first thing that I thought of. Just as I was about to express my fear of going suddenly deaf to my friend. "Bro, do you hear that?" he says. It sort of sounded like it was coming from the woods, but was very hard to pinpoint. We sat confused, looking at each other, basically being bothered by this ringing. House alarm? Bugging the woods? Satellite? Whatever it was, any louder, and it would have made me deaf for real. It was unlike any noise, frequency, pitch, whatever that I've ever heard. It literally shook my brain and bones, as if it entered me. The strangest thing about the ordeal was that my buddy's baby monitor turned off during the ringing. Sounds totally crazy, but it did. Absolutely no external sound besides the ringing. It eventually subsided slowly, until it completely went away, and the lullaby from the monitor came back on. Lasted probably no more than 45 seconds. A definitive what the hell moment for me and my buddy. We just sat there contemplating a dozen things that it could have been. But I guess it remains an unresolved phenomenon. Has anyone else experienced the hum? Number 5. My life has been turned upside down and backwards many times. So many times, in fact, that I wonder why the twists seem to take the shape that it has so repetitively. With the last several years culminating in several life changes that started when I was a child. Introspection set in, and I began to really sift through the years seeking answers, or at the very least, some kind of clues. Nearly going blind will do that to you. Nearly dying several times didn't seem to be the ticket. But those are tales for another time. The differences in my life from others I know has been so dramatic that in the growing darkness of my sight, I began to try and piece things together. I was always different. Going back into my memories, the differences begin right away. No one else I know can remember their first steps, getting their diapers changed, the distaste for the feel of plastic pants over their underpants as they are potty trained, the first feel and silence of being sat in a depression of snow at 10 or 11 months. I could read well before entering kindergarten because of my mother's teachings, since she labelled everything with the same name of the thing in our shared bedroom, even in my crib. Yes, I can clearly remember those times, even the abuses my parents and elder siblings sent my way, though those didn't ramp in intensity until after I was back home and turned 6 years old. Forgive me, I'm getting slightly ahead of myself, but with reason, as you will eventually find out. As to the blindness that I avoided, which you've undoubtedly been asking yourself about, trauma-induced cataracts from concussive impacts to my head, from beatings and car accidents. No, not when I was driving. These happened when I was a child, and before the law and normal use of seatbelts stepped in to protect us from ourselves. Now, needless to say, this is all completely true. I know you'll all wonder if this is the case. As I am a child of two nations, born in the US, this means a large amount of my cultural background goes into the sum of my parts, with a Cuban father and a mother from England. You can see what an amazing contrast there would be between the two parts of my family. The differences are so vast, with one half being very spiritual, Santeria being a large part of the religious makeup of the Cuban side, and on the other is the Celtic influence of my mother's family, with deep ties to the old faiths of the islands of the United Kingdom, all the way back to the old religion of pagans and druids. As a baby, I never knew how protected I was by my tías, which means aunts in Spanish, and their diligence to keep the house that we lived in safe from the other world that they knew was there, and feared terrifically, in fact. Constant blessings, use of camphor, holy water, and cleansing with incense happened all the time. They kept my dreams untroubled, and I feared the dark only because I could not see. Eventually we moved, and the home I would grow up in did not have any of those benefits, as I began to see things in the darkness most easily. Aside from feeling things, when I was near something spiritually active at a distance, I could see things too. Take for example my Uncle Mickey and his wife Olga. As a little child, we'd go there all the time because Auntie Olga was my godmother. Her mother lived with them, but had her own room, and was very old and in not the best of health. But she had an aura about her that said that she was kindly, and wished that she could do more when my brothers and sisters and I came to visit than just sit in her room or lie in bed. Sometimes, she'd be too exhausted to get out of bed, and we would have to play quietly on the other side of the house on the covered porch. I had a habit of wandering off and going places that I was told not to go, following feelings that seemed to draw me. In fact, sometimes I would wander blocks away from home or from parks, scaring my family silly. I would go to my tia Olga's mother's room, and as I'd walk in, a man standing next to her bed would look up and smile at me most of the time. My memory of him is hazy now, as it is of her, but I remember dark but warm eyes, steely grey hair swept back, and slicked back down to keep it neat with a light blue guayabera. He was thick in the upper body, muscular, but not overly so. I couldn't see his lower body, since he was on the other side of the bed. She would look away from him to me, following his gaze, and see me standing in the doorway. I would greet her, "Hola, señora," and then my Uncle Mickey said something from behind me to get my attention. I'd look, to turn to see what he said, and when I'd look back, the figure, the man that I had just seen, would be gone. There was no place for him to go, I should point out, and no one else lived there since my cousin, Michael, had moved out some years before. Keep in mind these events happened when I was 4. No one would ever tell me who that was. No one wanted to even mention it. The fact is, it only started whispers between adults about the events. Fearfully whispered discussions amongst them. Discussions that I was not even allowed to think on eavesdropping on. It wasn't long after that my Aunt Olga passed away. I never found out who the man was in the room with her, but I was assuming it was someone very close to her, for the simple fact that I never felt menaced by what I saw, and the room felt brighter as she passed. My mother's relations had come to visit us for a little while, and I do believe I even got to see my great Aunt Lily more than once in the US. My mother's father, Granddad, had been setting aside money since she'd left home to have her come home, either to stay or for a long visit, and this money he'd saved up from quitting smoking. Funnily enough, he'd been saving for so long that the amount had grown high enough for us all to come visit them during the summer. My father had to work, so he couldn't come with us. His job was very demanding, and our talismans, given to us by the Cuban side of our family, were not allowed to come with us, and remained in a box back home, despite our loud protestations. My mother was most insistent, as she was embarrassed by them. My time in England was not boring. We walked everywhere, or took buses or trains, and we were dragged to every mall, castle, monument and palace of interest that my mother could think of. This is in direct contrast to the part of Los Angeles where we lived, that required a car and a long trip to get anywhere meaningful. It was a shock, to say the very least. All of this whilst travelling between homes of my granddad and Nanny, that's my grandmother, and my Aunt Sonia and Aunt Celia in various places around the country. When we first went to stay with our Aunt Celia, it was a bit of a shock. Upon first stepping through the front door and removing our Wellington boots, I noticed that the air was thick and cold. To the left of the large front door was a toilet behind a closed door under a large staircase with a banister. My eyes were drawn to it as we were led inside by my aunt, distracted with talking to my mother about her coming wedding. Another reason for our presence, so my mother would be there for her younger sister's wedding. The cold stopped as we got to the 3rd stair and turned right onto the landing and proceeded up the stairs. Now the air was just thick and unwelcoming. We were shown to our rooms, the ones that we would be sleeping in. Us children. It was across the hall from Celia's room, and next to my mother's room. I kept looking at the door to my aunt's room, a pulsing sensation in my ears and pressing on my chest. So distracted was I. that I didn't even notice I was being asked something by my mother as she ushered me into the room to unpack. Celia smiled at me as she opened the door to her room. Something about getting into her regular clothing now that she was not travelling anymore that day. I looked past her into the room with eyes wide and the feeling of dread growing. She saw my curiosity. "What is it, Sean?" she asked. I looked past her shoulder into the room. Past her, I could see her bed and nothing else. I looked back at her as she entered the room, and then walked out of sight to the right towards what I would later learn was the walk-in wardrobe. During this, she crossed my view of the bed, and when it was clear enough again, I saw something that chilled me to the marrow, and the pressure came back enough to make me gasp. There, in the bed, now, sat an old woman in a sleeping cap and nightgown that looked like someone out of the 18th century. Her hair was grey and tied up in the cap. Her skin was parched and wrinkled. She couldn't have been older than 70. The woman was sitting there in the bed, looking in the direction that Celia had walked out of my field of view. Then slowly she turned to look at the doorway. It seemed at the time that she was turning her head at the sound of my gasp. Her eyes were angry and unwelcoming. At that moment my sister and mother walked past, breaking my line of sight. As they walked past to go down the stairs to get the rest of their suitcases and unpack, I stood frozen, my brother asking me what was wrong as they walked by. And after they'd passed, the woman was nowhere to be seen. I told no adult, nor my sister, as I remembered the response seeing things like this had gotten me in the past. I confided in my brother only, and he told me that he hadn't seen anything. He proceeded to tell my mother and sister all about it. During the rest of our stay, I kept my eyes averted from her room so that I wouldn't have to risk seeing that woman again, and refused to use the upstairs bathroom, and I'd have to pass her and risk seeing or feeling her presence again. My grandparents' flat had no oppressive feel to it, but there was a ghost all the same. A figure would walk into the bedroom where my brother and I slept, look around, and then leave. He was dressed in an odd helmet, shaped like a brimmed soup bowl, with a chain strap and a strange heavy jacket, with leather buckles that looked water resistant. I could never see his feet, as it was always too dark in the room. As the man entered, he always seemed to bring light with him, almost as if he glowed mildly. Otherwise I would not have been able to see much of him in the middle of the night. I have no idea if I woke each time he came, but when I did wake, it was usually prefaced by that feeling that I thought my mother had just walked up to check in on my brother and I, which she did now and again. It's important to note that my mother had a fear for graveyards. She's been tracing our family tree for ages, and this meant that we were usually dragged to find headstones with her maiden name on it. One particular grave near my grandfather's flat was apparently where my great-grandparents were buried. The graveyards were never empty of people walking through and looking around. We'd be there many times, clearing the weeds and bracken from the shared grave of my great-grandparents and placing flowers there before I asked my mother why so many people were milling about. Her answer was, "I don't know, Sean, what people?" She asked as she looked around, finally paying attention to what I asked her. As the youngest in the family, I'm rarely listened to, and almost everything I say was dismissed outright or ignored. Never before had I wished that my mother had ignored my question. I looked up at the people who were walking amongst the graves and pointed at them. Specifically, I pointed to a girl with reddish hair tied up in a pink ribbon, that was wearing a light sweater and a dress that dropped to her knees. We were in our rain gear, and this girl and all the others were not. they were all in different attire. They looked dressy, such as suits and dresses, whilst others were dressed casually. Some looked like they were dressed in the current clothing style. Some were considerably older. I had not noticed it from before that moment. Further, not a single one of them had an umbrella or rain gear of any kind. It was at that moment that I realized two things. Ghosts can appear in the daylight and outside, because as a child, I assumed that being outside and being daytime meant I was safe from them. But I was wrong. These ghosts had suddenly become aware of me, all of them, as if they were discomfited at scaring me. They all turned to look at me with an impassive expression on their faces, except for the girl I pointed at, and then each of them turned away and faded from sight. It was almost as if they had pulled a screen in front of themselves, or stepped from one room to another by changing the focus of their attention. The girl with the reddish hair and the pink ribbon, she didn't disappear. Instead, she smiled and stayed fairly close, listening to our conversation and watching, all in a completely non-threatening manner. No one seemed to notice her throughout the whole time we were there, which I was eager to cut as short as possible. Threatening or not, I was leery of her and unwilling to let her be close, always keeping my mother between us. I have no idea who she was, and I was too scared to find out or even try to talk to her. Funnily enough, the church for that graveyard is where my Aunt Cecilia was married that summer. That's where my grandfather was buried when he died of a massive heart attack in his flat in August, just after my mother's birthday. And no, I never saw him again. His spirit, despite staying in the flat for many more days, never came to me. Nor, might I add, did the man in the helmet ever appear for me again. I'm sure most of this seems innocent as far from dangerous for you guys, but you have to see it from the point of view of a 5-year-old child. Not only that, you'd have to understand that before this, I'd never encountered so many so often. I'd only ever seen things swirling or faces peeking out of my closet. But there was so much to be seen in England, ever more so. Though we stayed with the relations, we never went to stay with my Uncle Billy. We did, however, get some chance to visit distant relations, distant in both lineage and in mileage. One set was in Scotland, and with nothing spiritually noteworthy to say, except that I felt safe, almost as if I were back in my old home, as though something was protecting me. But the scariest experience I had was visiting our cousins Glenys and Roy. They were a nice couple, with a home that had a past, that had no clear answer for. At my aunt's wedding, we were told by my Aunt Celia about the ghost of the bed. It was an antagonistic spirit that menaced with only male adults that slept in the bedroom, shaking them with shrieks and attacking them in other more painful ways. They look into the history of the house, and it went back about 200 years, being one of the oldest homes in Wales, with a history rich and mostly lost through time. Of course, Roy had only been told these things and never tried to sleep there himself. A friend of his had tried and left in the middle of the night, never to return. No one stepped forward with more information as to why the spirit did what it did, whether it was male or female, or what had brought its darkness into the home in the first place. All this was recounted by Celia with dark glee, as she looked onto the paranormal, terrified at what I might end up seeing. The trip to Wales was long and arduous, as we had to stay on the train for several hours and make a few changes and then ride a bus. Before it was all over, I had been menaced by my sister and brother with the idea of ghosts in the house. Ghosts they didn't believe in or could see. Menaced with the idea of being put into a bedroom I was so scared of sleeping in. You know that that's how it is with children. We're going to put you in there, Sean. We're going to make you sleep upstairs with the ghost. They'd torment me, them wailing like ghosts, holding their hands up, making poses like a revenant out for human blood. I'd wail and run, scared out of my wits, already at the knowledge that I was going to be near it. Certain, in fact, despite my mother's claims that they wouldn't, and that they wouldn't make me sleep in that accursed room. I passed out on the last bus, despite trying to stay awake in order to make sure I was able to make certain that I was not put in the wrong room. My siblings had a nasty habit that once they knew about the ghosts I could see, they'd lock me in closets just to hear me shrieking in the dark, and it was sometimes not void of others. I was scared that they would force me into the room and make me face their threats. My fears were in vain, as they never did go through with it. I awoke slowly and softly to find myself in a bed already, despite the fact that I could tell by the ambient light that it was still daytime. It was also sunny outside. I was covered in a thick blanket that almost felt as heavy as one of those lead coats they throw on you when you get an X-ray at the dentist's office. It was warm and comfortable, and for several seconds I realized where I was. Then terror blossomed in my chest as my heart began to hammer against my little ribcage. I sat up, struggling under the weight of the blanket. Sitting up, I looked around the room. The bed was old, and I could hear the spring shafts as I did. The headboard was metal, rather like the kind that you see in old movies of hospitals, but it was much larger and wider. It seemed so large to me at the time, disproportionately big for a child of my small stature. To my right was a window within the pull-down, shade drawn from the lintel to within the inch of the sill. I could tell the window was open because of the way the shade moved slightly now and then from the air flowing around it, causing the sun that was coming in to vary in intensity. Under the window was a low chest of drawers made of dark-stained wood. It looked antique and sturdy, and to my left was a tall dresser that was at least 4 feet high but with no mirror on it, also made of dark-stained wood, that made me feel frightened for some reason by the lack of mirror. Directly beside the bed on the left was a nightstand made of lighter wood with a single drawer in it. I heard the sound of my family downstairs laughing loudly at something. It seemed to come up to me, as if to mock me, teasing me. Almost like I were put there on purpose or to test me, to torture me and to expose my fears. But after all, to them it was not real. It was explained away as imagination. How many times by my mother since coming to England? I'd lost count, and I could hear my brother and sister laughing at something. The low voice of Roy interjecting something now and again between the bursts of laughter. Well, I thought, I'll show them. I'll get away. I'll call them stupid and mean for trying to scare me and laugh about me, always picking on me, the smallest of the family, the butt of their insults and tortures. How many times had they locked me in a closet, with things reaching for me in the dark, or in a room with ghosts that could see me as well as I could see them, all in the name of helping me get over my fears. Tears began tracing down my face as I thought of this, but now they intensified from drops to streams that blurred my sight as my horror and feeling of betrayal intensified. My cheeks were soaked and stung slightly from the hot, salty tears. I moved to get up, but paused. I felt it then. Through the whole of my body I felt it, like suddenly I was deep underwater. The pressure was intense, and almost like a nightmare in intensity. Like drowning out of water, sinking deeper and deeper every second. The crushing feeling, growing tighter and tighter around me, pressing on my little chest. My shoulders creaked as they were forced into my body, and my wrists were crushed into my stomach, almost as if a gigantic hand was gripping me. Looking back now, I have no idea how I survived. I tried to move, but my arms could not defend whatever it was that held me. Another chorus of laughter from underneath the door drew my attention downwards, and I could see the gap beneath the door, with the light from the hallway illuminating a small patch of wooden carpet and the edge of the rug on which the bed sat on. Fighting to draw enough breath to scream for my mother, all I could do was sip the little air at the time into my lungs and let it out. I tried to make noise, little gasps for help, "Mummy," and calling for my sister and brother. But looking back, they couldn't have been louder than a whimper. They were far from where I was, and downstairs, and they would probably ignore me if they could, as they usually did. I felt betrayed, as well as terrified beyond comprehension, but it wasn't even close to what I was in for. A sound, distant but persistent and strange, reached my ears, and then in the silence of the room, it didn't echo. It seemed as though the sound was sucked away as soon as each sound finished. It grew steadily louder, and by the time I could tell it was getting closer, the grip hadn't lessened on me, and in fact, began to push down so my little legs were bent at painful angles on the bed. The springs squeaked in response to my downwards pressure into the bed, and then I heard my mother say, "I think I heard Sean upstairs. I'll check on him later," going to step out for a cigarette, and it trailed off, as she must have gone outside. The sound of the door opening and closing, and then silence. They had all stepped outside, and I could now hear the sound of my brother and sister laughing distantly from the open window to my right. My right hip protested, the pain of being crushed in the semi-sitting position with my right leg splayed out on the right, and my left extended in front of me. The noise I'd heard now seemed emboldened at being alone in the house. I could finally tell, at last, what it sounded like. It was like a groan, only it sounded like a person groaning whilst inhaling rather than exhaling. And it didn't stop this time. It was inhaling and making the sound, getting louder and louder and closer, but I couldn't see from where. My eyes were now rolling around my sockets, searching every corner of the room to see if I could find the source of the sound, all whilst my mind was crying for my mother, my tears now soaking through the neck of my polo shirt in front of my chest. The groan stopped for an instant, and then began again, louder this time, as I sensed it was very near. I looked down at the doorway. Something had attracted my attention despite the new burning pain in my chest. What attracted my gaze was the light from under the doorway, which was slowly going out. It was being blotted out, as if by shadows or something moving over the source of the left of the door to cover the light. Eventually the light was absorbed by a solid line of shadow, and I knew it could not have been a person. A person could not make this kind of completely eclipsing shadow over the light. There would be a shape of feet or legs or something. The sound was now just outside the wooden door, louder than before, and something more. It was not a single groan. It was the sound of several people. No, a chorus of them. And it sounded now almost like a painful gasping into air-starved lungs. Only it never paused to finish, taking the perpetual inward breath. The groan didn't sound like it stemmed from pain. No. It sounded almost like an engine getting going, as if it was drawing something it wanted into it. The louder it got, the more I hurt at the pressure of the crushing sensation. As I watched, the shadow over the light was taken by something darker, and it began to slide under the door. It was darker and fuller than before. I could see an amorphous mass sliding underneath the door that was darker than midnight, and it entered the room. The sunlight that came in and around the shade in the window grew dimmer. The pressure on my chest surged angrily as I was suddenly flung back in the bed and banged my head against the slated metal headboard, which in turn smashed the wall. The sound of it, though, should have been loud, but it sounded like a muffled clunk to me, as if the sound had been sucked away or muffled underwater or with a pillow. My head, now dazed from the collision, was too loopy and weak from lack of oxygen to appreciate the reality that I could now breathe. All thoughts of escape had long gone, and I wanted my mother to come and rescue me, to drive it off and protect me, to enfold me in her arms. But I realized that this would not happen. Despite her promises, she put me here and allowed me to be in there, and either way, she didn't really care about me. Blarily turning my gaze downwards, I watched the foot of the bed for signs as I prayed. Let me die fast so it can't touch me or take me. Please just let me die. I was so scared that all my limbs had gone cold from shock. The groaning started at an all-new intensity, revving upwards in the chorus of sounds, and my eyes grew wider in terror as the dark mass now surged upwards in the air as if standing. And it didn't even stop. It stood all spread out as if oozing into the air, sucking the warmth and oxygen from the room, the light growing dimmer and darker as I laid there, numbly panting in ultimate terror. My thighs grew hot as my urine burst free into my jeans and ran out of my pants and onto the bedding. The groaning changed, as if almost overjoyed, a triumphant tone, and it spread to the right and left like bat wings, reaching around to engulf me in its wicked hungry embrace. Please, 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 please. I realized I was panting, begging as my tears blurred my vision. The mass moved to the bed, and it slowly began to engulf me. All I heard was the groaning. It filled my ears, and then seemed to crawl into my head and echo there. A fresh weave of tears made it all, so I saw a blur and the cold feeling in all my limbs. My head propped at a strange angle against the headboard, forcing me to watch as it closed in. The anticipation of its icy touch on my already cold skin repulsed me, and I began to shiver uncontrollably. Then, just before I knew it was going to touch me, my vision cleared, and I could see that it was about to touch my shoulders and embrace me. The noise it made surged one last time, bestial sounds of the predator about to make a kill. But it was all suddenly blotted out of the intense, white-hot agony on the top of my head. A burning, watery feeling that was very intense happened at the top of my head. Wave upon wave of heat. An agony, like the top of my head had just been sawed open with a welding torch. But it didn't fade, and it was as if the room filled up with blinding white light, so bright that my eyes had automatically been drawn to slits to protect them. The whole room was filled with it, except for the Stygian patch of nightmare before me on the bed. It had halted in mid-reach and was now illuminated completely. I could somehow tell it was in pain. Now I could see it entirely, and I wished to heavens I never did. The thing was made up of the faces, images and bodies, all black against black but easily discernible, all caught mid-scream or wail or groan, in some position of pain or writhing, contorted in agony, moving slowly within the mass, undulating to the tone of their own trapped misfortune, all moulded together into a thin sheet of ultimate darkness, pressed into a fabric of utter damnation. This thing wanted me to be part of it. I just knew it. And though what it was may have once been human and had the potential for love and mercy, all that was left was the desire to add more to its flock of tortured souls. I have realized since then that the faces I saw, the darkness that it was all merely a covering for the real force behind it, the thing hiding behind the curtain of souls. The light in the room intensified, and the burn to my scalps lessened at last, allowing me to move slightly. The mass leapt off the bed and seemed to be sucked under the door, all while thrashing left and right. It passed into the hallway, and the groaning sound receded as sounds from the outside and the light returned to the room. I could hear my siblings playing and my mother talking to Glynis about something. The light was dimming finally, and I looked around the room to see where it was coming from, weakly swiveling my head to try and find the glimpse of the source. But it was against the wall. Nothing should have been able to be behind me, and that's exactly where it always seemed to be. My strength, what little the light had imparted, was flooding out of me rapidly. The thing was gone and I wanted to escape and get out of the room. Now, reaching my right arm to the left edge of the bed, I tried to grab onto it and pull myself out. I failed as the last of the light and the burning sensation fled me. I tumbled out of bed, heading onto the floor. I don't remember hitting the floor. In fact, I don't remember what happened for the next 3 days. My next memories were that, heading away from the train station in her town and on our way to her house. It took a long time to piece together the story, but here's what I know. They thought I'd fallen out of bed after peeing on it on the first day. I'd gotten up, cleaned myself off, and my mother found me half-clothed trying to change the sheets. They fed us supper. I ate heartily at the wonderful food that Glynis had cooked, and then we'd gone to bed. Throughout it all, I acted normally. That was that, but I remembered none of it. Perhaps it was the shock. What I do remember was eating the Welsh cakes that Glynis had made herself. Even made me a snack to eat. That my brother didn't like them, and that my sister was trying to stay in shape for gymnastics. You can say I'm delusional, or that I'm not sane. You can say anything you like. I was never more scared than I was that day. Because I was a little boy, but I know what I saw. In case you're wondering, did it stay in that house? No. In fact, Glynis and Roy said that after we were there, during a visit to the US before they moved to New Zealand, someone across the street had died, and they figured it had gone to follow the person. Roy slept in the room once to make sure nothing had happened. I had a different take on things, but never spoke to them of what I knew. Wasn't worthwhile telling them that the thing followed me and made my life hell. Guilt never solved anything. I don't know what it was, I didn't care to name it. Give it a name if you need one, I couldn't care less. What I do care about is from that day, my life went different. It couldn't get to me, so my family turned dark. I don't know if it was the thing that wouldn't let the people sleep, or the tale that we were told. What I care about is that my family went from being what it was, to cruel and vicious. After we came home, the darkness got to my father. I know this because he beat me until I was unable to control my body function, and even gave me a concussion. All on Christmas Day of 1977. Merry Christmas. And why? Because I accidentally opened the wrong present. Car accidents followed. My father began to drive angry, regularly. I nearly went through a windshield with a full backpack at age 9. The only thing stopping me was the fact that the window wasn't made to shatter. 1970s construction. Gotta love it. My mother began to regularly dish out damage to me because my siblings would blame me for things and wanted to see me get punished. My siblings began to use me as a whipping boy when they were upset. It made me feel worthless, and I withdrew from their presence as much as I could. This seemed to make them more antagonistic. My brother acted as if he were always being edged on to find anything that he could to get away with hitting me on the head with. This even included putting a metal nut on his finger and lashing out at my head when no one was looking, especially the top of my head. Complaining to my mother was useless. The only solace I had in this time came from my Cuban grandfather Papacito. He would protect me when I was near him. I was safest from all of them. Naturally, this dark thing made sure he was gone as soon as possible. My parents divorced suddenly, and my mother drove off my aunts and grandparents. Despite the fact that they lived next door to us, she found a way to make them move. After that point, cataracts started to form. and though I could see spiritual things somewhat as dim outlines, I could not see them as clearly as before. No longer did they look like normal people. Now I have ocular implants, and I can see as well as any of you can see. Mostly. A few more laser treatments and no more cataracts. And my ability to see ghosts is as it was when I was 5. I know this because I was shopping one day after my first surgery and left my eye unbandaged 2 days prior. A little girl ran past me, giggling, and knocked over produce as I watched, then ran through a cart loaded with produce as if it wasn't there. The person stocking the produce, a little dour-looking Hispanic lady, never looked up to follow her. She only humphed in annoyance and picked up the peppers, putting them back where they belonged. I asked if she saw the girl, and she gave me a puzzled look. You may be wondering, does misfortune follow me still? And are my steps dodged by this thing? No. Thankfully it's gone now, and with good reason I might add. But that, as they say, is another story. Number 6. My mother was arrested for drug possession one summer. My ex-roommate and myself were invited to stay at my mother's friend's house that very night, because our house was experiencing severe problems regarding the electricity and power. It was around midnight when we began turning off the lights, as well as the TV, and prepared for bed. About 20 minutes later, I hear what sounds like my mother's voice calling my name from what I assume was outside, which absolutely shook me. So much so that I shot up out of bed like a bullet and stared directly at the front door in the distance. I thought I was going insane when I asked my roommate if she heard it too. She replied that she had, and I just about had a meltdown. I learned that morning that my mother was in the police department all night, which was pretty goddamn far from the house we resided in. I've experienced paranormal activity just about my entire life. Everything ranging from blue lights hovering over our desert town, only to shoot across the sky in a blink of an eye, to ghostly women gripping my hand when I was a child, and leading me to different places within my house, which, by the way, were not very far from an ancient graveyard. I've always tried my best to remain skeptical about the supernatural and paranormal, but damn, that voice mimicking my mum was absolutely wild. Molly? Where are you? Absolutely creepy as hell. Whatever it was, I hope it never comes back. Number 7. Early this morning at approximately 3 AM, our 8-year-old daughter came into our room because she couldn't sleep. As I sat up to let her crawl into our bed to sleep between us, I noticed something standing behind her. It's hard to explain. It was tall, probably around 6 foot, and slender, and I could see through, but it was an outline. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to scare my daughter, and I lay back down hoping that if I ignored it, it would go away. About 2 minutes pass, and it says my name. I turn around to look into its face. I sense we make eye contact and it disappeared. I turn back towards my daughter and hold her. 2 hours later, as my husband and I are making breakfast, I mention the encounter to him. He states that when our daughter came into the room, he saw another person in the room. He originally thought it was me standing behind our kid. I explained to him I never got out of the bed, and then he asked me if the voice sounded male or female. We both kind of stopped talking about it and went on with our morning. I don't know what it was, but it really creeped me out. Number 8. I've been home alone all day with my dog, watching football. I live with my parents, but they've been gone all day, working on a house they recently bought. 2 hours ago, I left my house to go wash my truck at the nearest car wash. Shortly after, and one clean truck later, I returned home. Upon doing so, I came inside, took my dog out, let him back in shortly after, and gave him a treat. The dog runs off and I begin washing the dishes. The only dog we have now is an old year Boston Terrier. Our boxer recently passed, leaving us with only this one. Being a young dog, he has a lot of energy and very often goes to the bonus room, right above the kitchen, to run figure eights around the couches until he's tired. So, there I stood washing dishes, and I hear him start to circuit run upstairs. Man, he was wide open, and it went on for about 5 minutes before he instantly stopped. As I mentioned before, I was in the kitchen, and my parents' bed is visible from the kitchen sink where I stood. Right as he stopped running, I just happened to look into their room, and what do I see? My only dog on the bed asleep. I instantly froze. It felt like the gears in my brain were screeching to a halt, as I stood, trying to figure out what I'd just heard, or how he got so fast downstairs without me noticing and fell asleep. After standing at the sink confused for longer than I would like to admit, I finished the dishes and go to the laundry room to tend to my clothes. The laundry room is between my parents' bedroom and the stairs going up to the bonus room. I stood, folding clothes, when I see my dog, now awake, walk slowly by the door towards the stairs, with his head inches from the ground. Again I froze. I hear it. My dog begins growling quietly and deeply. I peep my head out of the laundry room, and he is at the foot of the stairs staring upwards towards the top, hairs on his neck straight up, steadily growling. This is all I wanted. I'm not afraid to admit it. It freaked me out. As if this wasn't enough, I called my dog and had him follow me back to the living room to sit up on the couch. As I'm sitting on the couch trying to play it cool for a while, my mind runs 99 miles per hour as I look out the living room window across the back porch towards my bedroom window and see something flash across the window. I thought, that's enough. Someone or something is in my house. I had considered this before, but there was no physical evidence, so I jumped up and ran to my bedroom, and nothing. There's no one there. Nothing moving. With this I decide I'm okay. I'm grabbing the dog, and I'm not leaving until my parents get home, and we can clean the house together. Number 9. We moved into a rental house in a pretty villa suburban neighborhood when we moved to a new state. Around this time, my son started having problems going to sleep at night. It's normal for toddler boys to have night terrors and whatnot. He would frequently wake up and burst into tears. He was little. He couldn't articulate what was going on, but he was afraid. We connected the dots one night when my wife was reading for him before bed. Out of the blue, whilst pointing to the corner of his room by the closet, my son asked, "Is that man Daddy?" There were no shadows, nothing in the corner. He was around 2 at the time, so he was going to bed when it was still relatively light outside. He saw the form of a man standing in the corner. He only mentioned it one other time when he came out of his room asking, "Who is in my room?" We checked, and no one was there. We wonder if he was seeing him at night, and it was scaring him, because in the course of the year he saw someone twice during the day, and I fear what he saw at night. After we moved, he never mentioned it again. I don't think he remembers it, and for that, I am thankful. Number 10. I remember seeing my grandmother when she passed. I know, I saw her and I wasn't dreaming. She wasn't transparent or anything. It was just like seeing someone who's alive today. There were also other experiences I had growing up in my childhood home. With that, I'm still not sure of what I saw and experienced. I wonder if the mind plays tricks on you and makes you think about what you saw. So this story. I was visiting my mum last night with my kids. My mum had a chihuahua who passed about 5 years ago. He was a mean little bastard, but he loved me for some reason. My mum had told several friends that she would see him several times after he'd passed. She said it would always be out of the corner of her eye, like a fleeting glimpse. She has 3 dogs now, and I had my dog with me. He's a black poodle. She has 2 chihuahuas, a brown, a black one, and a white shih tzu. My brother, son, and all the dogs were sitting outside on the porch. My mother and daughter were in the bedroom talking, and I had gotten up to go to the kitchen to get a drink of water and asked my daughter if she was ready to go home. I get a drink and walk out towards the kitchen into the hallway. There's a bathroom to the right of the hallway, and as I entered, I saw the tail of an end of a dog go into the bathroom. I didn't think anything of it, because like I said, there were 4 dogs there. I glanced into the bathroom as I passed to see which dog it was, but the bathroom was dark and empty. I turned on the lights and went inside. No dog. Just then, my brother came in from outside, and I asked him if any of the dogs had come inside the house. He said no, they're still outside. I said I just saw a dog go into the bathroom, and he looked at me. Well, all the dogs are out here. I went on into the bedroom where my mother and daughter were, and I told them what I saw. My mother said, "It was Levy. I told you I see him all the time." I know. I saw a dog go into that bathroom. There is no way that you could convince me that I didn't. It didn't scare me or freak me out. It just really got me thinking that I saw something paranormal.